everyone, and welcome to another installment of August Conversations, a series of short discussions on topical issues that we're seen in the corporate world and beyond through the lens of strategic communications and public affairs. Today, we're focusing on ESG, a broadly defined movement intended to direct investment dollars towards companies that successfully pursue environmental, social, and governance-related initiatives. Companies of all sizes are seeking to implement ESG initiatives that appeal to an ever-broadening set of investors while also managing the expectations of their other stakeholders. As you've likely seen, rhetoric regarding ESG has heated up, and corporations and their communications teams are focusing now more than ever on what to say and what to do. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by two experts on ESG and its impact on strategic communications, who will spotlight some of the most important ESG-related developments and dissect what they mean for corporate communications. Michael Robinson is chairman and CEO of the Washington, D.C.-based firm, the Montgomery Strategies Group, a full-service agency specializing in corporate reputation and brand awareness campaigns, crisis and litigation communications, as well as public affairs and regulatory advocacy. Michael is particularly well-versed in the issues surrounding the politicization of ESG and the potential impacts to companies that incorporate ESG into their businesses. I'm also joined by August co-founder and CEO Stephen Goldberg, who's been closely following recent ESG developments and the important role communications plays in the perception of corporate ESG efforts. So without further ado, let's get into it. I'd like to start by talking about some of the complex political tensions around ESG that are continuing to escalate. So for some background, Republican politicians have commonly been outspoken in their opposition to ESG investing, arguing that investment managers should ignore ESG initiatives in favor of maximizing investment returns. In fact, Republican lawmakers are so anti-ESG that earlier this month they pushed legislation through Congress that would prohibit state pension fund investment advisors from considering ESG factors in their fund's investment decisions. Despite these efforts, which included convincing two Democrats to cross party lines, it is widely expected that President Biden will veto the resolution, reinstating the status quo in which those investment advisors are permitted to use their discretion in whether to consider ESG factors in investment decisions. Yet on the other end of the increasingly complex spectrum, publications including New York Times have recently reported that some red states are actually beginning to push back on, or otherwise loosen, the ESG investment bans that they previously supported, now arguing that banning investment in companies that prioritize ESG has actually forced investment managers to abandon their fiduciary duties because it has caused them to avoid investments that would actually be the most financially sound for their constituents. So with these conflicting factors taken into consideration, how do you think companies should be trying to position themselves with stakeholders in this uncertain environment? For example, should they double down on ESG and be shouting their initiatives from the rooftop? Or would it be better to take a more neutral position as political rhetoric continues to heat up?
Well, Jenny, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here and coming to you from inside the Beltway, where, ESG has been weaponized. It's been weaponized by the left. It's been weaponized by the right. And I think what the result of that is there's a lot of space in the middle for companies that truly, honestly want to pursue this on a long-term basis. They can occupy that space. I think in your question, you're exactly right. The real question is about stakeholders. And like any corporate decision, navigating between the demands of everyone from who are your investors, to your employees, to your board, to your customers, and everybody in between is going to be a challenge. It is particularly fraught given that we exist in a political environment. It's 2023 now. We know the presidential election is already started in earnest, and that doesn't include what happens at the state level. So whether companies ought to double down or whether they ought to pull back, I'm not sure that's the right decision or the right question. I think where they need to think about is what can they do and say that is a solid demonstration of why they're pursuing ESG. What is that going to produce in terms of results, both in the near term and the long term? I mean, ESG is not going to go away. Neither of these political demands or these political minefields. So the question is, how do you navigate forward in something that does indeed have long-term value?
Yeah, Michael, I agree. I think given the political dynamics and the polarized environment, which is only getting worse and will continue to get worse, as you say, with the presidential election looming, I think that there are really two things companies can focus on to help navigate the challenges of how to talk about ESG. The first is to tie what you're doing to your corporate values. ESG is a potential crisis for any company if they get in the crosshairs of people who are against ESG investing or stakeholders who have a particular political view. And like any crisis, you want to make sure that you are responding to it from a communications perspective by sticking to your corporate values. So I think whatever you do in terms of communicating about ESG as a business strategy has to be tied to your corporate values. Second, I think it goes to what you were saying, Jenny, about how some Republican legislatures are at the state level, there's some backlash now because they're seeing that they're missing opportunities to maximize value, is to tie ESG initiatives to their fiduciary duties to maximize value for their stakeholders or for their investors. In fact, a week or so ago, I saw a quote from Larry Fink of BlackRock. Now, BlackRock has probably been the most prominent company that has been in the public eye, if you will, about ESG and their strategies. And what he basically said is, we're not using ESG as a guideline for our investments because we're environmentalists. We are doing it because we are capitalists and we are fiduciaries for our clients. And what he's essentially saying is that ESG is good business. Because if you're not managing for the implications of climate change or social or governance issues and then what the impact that's going to have on your stakeholders in your business, you're not being good fiduciaries for your clients or for your investors.
And to add to that, from a Washington perspective, it's important to distinguish between the rhetoric you hear on Capitol Hill and the more important and long-lasting impact that regulation can have. It is often said that the most dangerous place in Washington to be is between a member of Congress and a television camera. However, the real impact of ESG on business is going to come from what the SEC is doing with respect to the new rules on climate change reporting. And there's some discussion currently about whether that includes scope 3 or just scope 1 and 2. We know for a fact that the commission has gotten more comment letters on this proposal than anything since it was formed in the 1930s, by far. So as an organization, Stephen, you're exactly right, sticking to your values and understanding what's noise and needs to be ignored, even though it may be tempting to respond to it in the near term, and focusing on the long term. Experience dictates that slow and steady wins this race, and not be distracted, not dragged into a Twitter war.
Yeah, I'll make one other point, Jenny, because part of your question was, should companies be conservative in how they talk about this, or they should be shouting from the rooftops or somewhere in between? I think it's probably not shouting from the rooftops, and I don't think it's hiding behind this as being good business. It's when there's opportunities to communicate or there's a need to communicate about ESG as a component of your business strategy, it should be done in an organic way. And again, it should be done with messaging and language that's consistent with the company's values and ties the approach to what's best for the long-term objectives of the company and its stakeholders.
100%. Look, every time you open up your Google search engine, it says carbon neutral since 2007. Well, it's really easy for Google to be carbon neutral, right? It's a lot more difficult for a steel company, a car company, a chemical company, a paint company. So all of your messaging and all of your communication strategy obviously has to begin with who you are in the industry you're in.
As a follow-up to that, do you see a light at the end of the tunnel where ESG becomes less hotly debated and more widely accepted across the political spectrum? What would need to change, and how might companies help spur that change?
Unfortunately, I think the light in the tunnel is the train coming at you. Just yesterday, Governor DeSantis, obviously he's going to announce his campaign for the presidency on the Republican side, was joined by 18 other governors in a very powerful pushback on ESG issues, which is really a very convenient political acronym for woke. It doesn't mean a lot. There's probably not a lot there, but it gives them a platform to push back on all sorts of issues. Education issues, everything up to and including, inoculations for the next COVID virus. So it's become a symbol that some Republican governors, in one of the 18 is Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Not surprising where those states are if you looked at the map, right? So unfortunately, I don't see it abating. I see it increasing. It will be a political football through the 2024 election. And remember, not just at the federal level, but also at the state level. There are a lot of governor's races, a lot of state house races where these too will be issues. And states have a lot more flexibility, Jenny, as you mentioned earlier, to take action and either ban ESG, whatever really that means in the context of a financial perspective, or not. And so, unfortunately, this is getting roped into larger conversations.
I agree with Michael. I don't see this abating anytime soon. I'm sure it's going to continue to become a very hot button issue. There's no better evidence of that, I don't think, than part of the reaction to the collapse of SVB, which was for certain Republicans and including some Fox News personalities commenting on the failure being attributable to their woke governance policies and attempts to diversify their leadership and board. Part of ESG is governance. And so I think that was a shot at that piece of ESG and saying that part of the reason why SVB failed is they were too focused on being a woke company and focusing their investments or guiding their investments based on ESG considerations. Kind of an undertone in that rhetoric is that trying to diversify somehow is bad business, that certain segment of the population is better suited to manage a financial institution or a bank or any company for that matter, which seems to be a strange thing to be saying in the current environment, but Republicans have clearly embraced the idea of that message. And if they're going to make the collapse of SVB be a point where they can try to score, a place where they can score political points on ESG, that I don't see it becoming a lesser issue over the next couple of years and beyond.
Yeah, I think everything we hear is going to be viewed through this prism, right? Now, I'll tell you what's going to come next. When you start talking about reforming Social Security and Medicare and, you might want to privatize Social Security investing or to some part. Well, what can you invest in? So there is no macro issue that won't potentially be viewed through the ESG prism on both sides. And I think what happens, and Stephen hit it exactly right, is that becomes a barbell. It pushes everyone to either camp. And what it does, and I think from a communications perspective, is leave open the middle, where responsible companies with a real program that can tie to their values, that can point to real results over time, have the opportunity to tell their story.
Thank you both. I'd like to pivot a bit and get your take on another recent issue, and that is regarding the many large global companies that are failing to live up to their net zero pledges. In February, Bloomberg covered a report released by the Corporate Climate Responsibility Monitor, which found many of the world's largest companies that made net zero and other carbon reduction pledges are falling woefully short of their targets, and certainly far short of the progress necessary to prevent a catastrophic increase in global temperatures. According to the report, these companies have made unattainable pledges in response to consumer and investor pressure, as well as calls for a ban on misleading climate claims, better enforcement of existing regulations, and better oversight to prevent companies from quote-unquote greenwashing. The report also indicates most of these companies' future net zero goals and current climate claims are quote-unquote exaggerated, false, and misleading. It seems that companies are making sweeping claims about ESG initiatives that in some instances are clearly directed at consumers. However, it is precisely those consumers who may be less equipped to understand the initiatives and how to assess progress, and as a result, these companies are not being held accountable. So with that said, how should corporate communications professionals navigate around and avoid perceptions of greenwashing? What tools or tips should these professionals use to increase the probability that corporate messaging on ESG efforts generally rings true to a given company stakeholders?
Well, I'll start on this one and let Michael weigh in after. I think this is another situation where Michael alluded to this before in a different context. You really have to understand your stakeholders and your vulnerabilities and what the likelihood is if you make pledges or promises and you're called out for it, that it becomes a business issue. Remember, we're talking right now purely about a communication strategy, what the risks are if you make pledges or promises or you're called out for it. So how should corporate communications executives or C-suite or boards think about these issues? It's understanding what the vulnerabilities are amongst your stakeholders, what the impact could be on your business if you start getting criticism for the promises you made and the failure to live up to those promises. And be prepared for how you're going to respond in terms of the commitments you've made, how you plan to address those going forward if you've not met those commitments to date, and understanding how your stakeholders are going to react to that messaging if you are in the public eye for those issues.
Exactly. I mean, I'd sum it up by saying, under promise and over deliver. And we all know that in other areas of corporate communications and in public affairs. We certainly all know that in the investor relations world, where every securities lawyer you ever met will tell you can't use absolutes among about approximately are words that often populate all of those communications. It's no different here. It's important to have a long-term strategic goal to articulate how you're going to get there. Yes, you want to have a timeline, but you want to have some flexibility. And Stephen's exactly right on how you would approach it from the communications and the perception perspective. If you talk about you're going to do it all right away, no one's going to believe you. I mean, ultimately, rhetoric and reality have to match.
I also think you need to be prepared, as we said before, in the ESG context, generally, which is it's a potential crisis, and if you're not planning for that as a potential crisis, then you're going to get caught flat-footed and not have a good response if and when it does surface. So I think if there is a risk of that becoming a crisis for your company, and you don't have a plan for how to address it, if it becomes an issue for example, a consumer-focused company and their consumers start a campaign and it takes over social media in some way, and there's a sufficient wave of criticism that you're not prepared to respond to, then you're gonna exacerbate the problem. But if you've got good responses with data and accomplishments to date and realistic plans for how to continue to make progress in those areas, then you're going to be in the best position to respond to that potential crisis.
And do so immediately. Again, referencing Silicon Valley Bank, whether you believe the allegation earlier in the week that this is the first Twitter-inspired bank run or not, it had an impact. And there's still a lot of people out on Twitter spouting all sorts of theories one way or the other. But unless you're able to, with data and facts and examples, immediately engage, you're behind.
Absolutely. Thank you both. To close, I'd like to leave viewers with final thoughts from each of you regarding what you believe ESG investing will look like, not just in the next couple of years, but in 5 years and 10 years. What changes do you believe will take place over the next decade in response to today's turmoil, and what impact will that have on strategic communicators?
Yeah, I think companies will find value in making more disclosure. They will find that valuable once they begin to have a good track record, and not only with as an organization, but within the industry group that they occupy. And that industry group may be, all car companies or Fortune 50 companies. So it can be both vertical and horizontal. I think companies will find value in it. I think stakeholders will begin to understand that different organizations are going to move at different speeds because they have more obstacles than, say, others, right? I mean, it's one thing if you make things, actually make cars, make airplanes. It's another thing if you write software. And I think that nuance, that level of detail will become understood over time.
Yeah, I will go back to what Larry Fink said, which is we're capitalists. And I think the way ESG will develop as the political issue kind of normalizes, if you will, over time, whatever's good business will dictate the way ESG develops in the coming years. Because you're already seeing it, as you said at the beginning, Jenny, with some Republican legislatures trying to backtrack because they're realizing they're losing opportunities where there's investments they could have made that would be in the best interest of their stakeholders or investors that they're not pursuing because of these anti-ESG policies. And over time, if business, the corporate world, broadly speaking, believes that factoring in ESG into investment strategies is good business, it will become a bigger part of the strategy and less polarized and more accepted. But if it's continued to be viewed as something that is only done for the sake of being woke or to promote liberal policies and not good business, then there's going to continue to be these high-profile issues and debates and criticisms. Where I think it will be headed is exactly where Larry Fink's comments suggest it will be headed, which is companies saying that their strategies are driven by what is in the best interest of their stakeholders and in accordance with their fiduciary duties. And that is taking into account environmental, social, and governance issues is good business, and that they are going to mold their ESG strategies in accordance with those fiduciary duties and capitalistic tendencies.
Cool. Thank you, Stephen and Michael, so much for your time today. And that's a wrap on today's episode of August Conversations. See you next time.